Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to our PDO's LinkedIn Live. Here we talk about the account-based sales revolution. And today we talk about how to develop world-class sales people. Scott, I don't want to put any pressure on you, but this is a decisive moment of my sales career. We'll talk about what are the key ingredients of world-class salespeople. So I guess in a couple of minutes, I find out if I should pursue this career any longer or should I quit my job tomorrow. Besides that, another decisive point will be when we talk about the US and Europe in terms of sales, what the differences are. So, of course, based on your recommendations on that, I might be packing my suitcase and move in with you in San Francisco after.
Love it.
One last point we'll talk about is sales methodologies, and if there is a best sales methodology out there. And yeah, Scott, I know we threw in some big words with world class, but I think you are the one. If there is someone who can live up to these expectations, it's a big pleasure having you here. And yeah, I would suggest we kick it off, or you kick it off with a brief introduction to yourself.
Yeah, Max, that's an awesome opening. It puts a lot of pressure on me, but hopefully we'll have a great conversation here. So thank you very much. At a high level, I run the U.S. sales organization for a company called Cloudinary, and Cloudinary is a great company. We're a bit under the radar in the traditional sense, but what we lack in hubris, we make up more. We definitely more than make up for it in having a great product, a great culture, and great customers that's allowed us to blow past the $100 million ARR benchmark that a lot of SaaS companies set for themselves. The company itself, what we've developed is what we call a media experience cloud. And what that means is that for companies that have a large number of digital assets, so beyond just that includes your imagery, your video, but also AR and VR and 360 sets and so on, we help to manage the entire life cycle of that asset. And what that means is that from the time that image or video leaves the camera, we support the collaboration, the editing, the manipulation, the delivery of that asset. And the result is that these assets, they get on our customer sites faster with fewer human touches that lead to a decrease in time to market and an increase in revenue. So our customers are basically the who's who in retail and hospitality and media. And that includes Adidas, Nike, Tesla, NBC, and about 10,000 other organizations that leverage Cloudinary day in and day out.
Super interesting. Impressive numbers also. Impressive numbers.
Thank you.
Before we pick up the theme of this session, could you take us back on when it started with your sales career? I know you've been in many different roles, and it's a very inspiring career you made. And maybe also touch upon, was it planned? Did you see yourself from the start being in sales?
I like to tell people that I got into it genetically. My grandfather on my father's side ran the sales for the U.S. For a company called Prudential. And for our international viewers, Prudential is a large life insurance company based here in the U.S. And my grandfather essentially ran that from the 50s to the early 80s when he retired. He had a really good life. He, country clubs and international travel and lived in the nice neighborhoods and sent kids to private school and all of that. And, as a young kid, I was kind of enamored by that. But life insurance to me was boring as hell. And he was pushing me hard to go into life insurance, and it just was not interesting to me at all. So as a kid, I would be selling magazines and candy bars to raise money for my baseball team. I always did pretty well around in doing that, would win the contests and that kind of thing. So I guess at a young age, I was pretty good at it. I think that, more than anything, I was just fearless when it came to knocking on my neighbors' doors and asking them for money. And if you want to figure out if you could be good at sales, I would recommend doing door-to-door sales, because there's probably not a harder job in the world than knocking on a stranger's door and trying to ask them for an appointment or ask them for money. From there, and I actually did that. I had a job selling home improvements when I was about 18. And what I mean by that is I was responsible for selling roofing, siding, new windows, decks, like whatever it is that you want to add on to your house. And I would literally have to like drive to nice neighborhoods, and I had a car that barely ran, and I'm driving into these neighborhoods, and I'm trying to convince people that they should, spend a little bit of time with me and figure out how to, how to sell them something. And Max, I was terrible at it. I think in the 9 months that I worked there, and thankfully the owner of the company liked me because he kept me on board for 9 months and paid me a small stipend of a salary. But man, I was awful. In 9 months, I closed one deal. And the one deal that I did close, I sold a deck to an old man. And a day later, I got a phone call from his son saying, my father is mentally incapacitated and can't sign contracts. And therefore, we're not going to be giving you we're not signing this contract at all. This is null and void. And that was kind of the end of my experience in selling home improvements. But I'd always had a penchant for technology. I started programming as a kid when I was probably 9 or 10 years old, and really got into coding at a fairly young age, and had the propensity to talk about technology. And I was in a weird situation when I was about 21 years old, where I needed to move out of an apartment where I was living with a handful of people and get my own place. And in order to do that, I needed to make some money because the job that I had that was paying me $5 or $6 an hour was not cutting it to be able to have my own apartment. So I found an opportunity at a company called SoftMart. I grew up in Philadelphia, and SoftMart was a software reseller just outside of the city. And I saw an ad in the newspaper. Like, I'm kind of dating myself here, back when people would find jobs in newspapers. Saw an ad in the newspaper, said, hey, okay, I'll show up for this interview. And little did I know, but the interview was almost like a gladiator-like situation. They stuck me in a room with about 20 or 25 people, and they just started rapid firing questions at all of us. And 30 minutes later, they had narrowed that down to about 5 people. And then they did the same thing. And they're asking us questions like, what would you do in this situation? What would you do in that situation? How would you answer this? And then 30 minutes later, they narrowed it down to 3 people. And then 30 minutes later, I came out the winner for the job. It was cool. Like, it was like the first and like only time in my career where I had been in like a group interview setting for a job, but it was fun. And, I kind of wish those things would come back a little bit. And I guess maybe for like entry-level jobs are still there, but it was like, you absolutely have to perform under pressure when you're kind of up against 20 other people for a job. But my job at SoftMart was to sell Borland's software. Borland, back in the kind of late 80s and early 90s, was one of the largest software companies in the world. They're famous for saying Windows is never going to make it, and therefore they didn't port anything to Windows until much too late. But at the time when I joined the company, it was probably $200 or $300 million company, and I was selling Borland at SoftMart. The Borland people liked me enough to offer me a job, and they said, "Hey, do you want to move from Philadelphia to Santa Cruz, California?" And I wasn't sure if they were talking to me, but it turned out they were. And lo and behold, I love Santa Cruz, and I never went back to Philadelphia. So I've been in technology now for whatever that is, 27 or 28 years selling software.
Nice. And
it's been a good run.
Yeah, for sure. And also my next question, this is going to be my favorite question of this session, but it's really tying into this experience and your background and all the things you've seen and the different roles you've been in, and also the theme of this session. So for you, what are the most important ingredients for a world-class salesperson?
Yeah, it's such an important question, and it's something that I have been studying for probably 6 or 7 years now, Max. My real interest in this started with reading books on like how do you hire great salespeople. Like there's a good book out there called Never Hire a Bad Salesperson Again, or something along those lines. And for sales leaders, I would recommend reading it. When I read that, I really wanted to see I think that book gives like a good, very high level overview of like what makes a good salesperson. And what they focus on is grit and optimism and competitiveness. But I think that it has to go a little bit more tactical than that. Like, I think that if you have those 3 characteristics, like, you can probably be a pretty good salesperson. But when I started to think about the best salespeople that I'd worked with in my entire career, like people who make, SaaS sellers that make more than $1 million a year because they know how to go close massive, big, gnarly, complicated deals. What I really wanted to do was figure out what made those people tick, and like how were they so good at doing that, and where did people kind of miss the ball and those people were able to kind of execute in a better way. And I came up with a list of 5 things. And then when I talked to you last week, you actually gave me a really good idea. So I added a 6th one there. So we're going to get a bonus answer to this
Nice.
today. The first one for me, Max, is just a relentless focus on moving a deal forward. And what I mean by that is that, too often I think a lot of salespeople, especially new salespeople, get to the end of a meeting and they go, okay, Max, like this was a really fun conversation. What should our next steps be? And to me, that is just an absolute train wreck of a question that you can ask. And it seems obvious, but it's not a good question. And what you should be doing is dictating what those steps are up front and being consistent about them. So instead of saying, hey, Max, what should our next steps be? That question should be, hey, Max, like when we started this conversation, we agreed that our next steps were going to be A, B, and C. Do you remember that? And are we on board with that? And should we be getting those steps on the calendar? Right. And if you just ask it that way, what you're going to figure out really fast is like the person's either going to go, yeah, like Scott, let's go do this. Or they're going to say, nah, you know what, like this is a little bit too much for me. And I don't want to go do these things. But either way, very quickly whether or not you have a deal. And I can tell pretty quickly if you're a good salesperson, just simply by asking you what the next step is in your deal. Yeah. And if you say, my next step is X, like that's a pretty good sign. If you say my next step is, X, Y, and Z, and like, here's the dates for X, Y, and Z, then like that person has got their act together. And if I say, hey, what's the next step? And the person's like, I'm not really sure. I need to pick up the phone and call that person. Like that person is not a good salesperson because they just don't understand what the next, like they don't understand how to manage and process a deal. So that's kind of my number one thing. My number 2 thing is just consistently thinking about client success. And I think that this one is probably the hardest one for a lot of sellers because salespeople and maybe people in general are inherently a little bit selfish. And I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way, but let's just be honest. I think a great salesperson is going to ask questions about what else is going on aside from the project that we're talking about. Right? Because I want to know, like, am I priority number 1? Am I priority number 3? Or am I priority number 20, like way down at the bottom of the list? So I know that if I'm like the number 3 priority, I got to figure out what those other 2 things are. And maybe I can help influence those other 2 projects. Maybe I know somebody that can help to make those projects go a little bit faster. And I want to make sure that my champion is successful with those 2 projects. So that way he can focus on my thing. And I think that too often salespeople get wrapped up in their own deal and they don't really think about the larger picture. And I think like we also kind of forget that like your customer has a job that's not just buying, in my case, not just buying Cloudinary. They have like, other projects going on. They've got their bosses asking them to do something. The people that work for them are asking them to do something. Like they have a lot of things happening. So, anything that a salesperson can do to just help make your prospect or your champion or your client more successful in other areas of life is going to make you successful. The third one is navigates an organization, right? You can't get single threaded. And this is so important. Gong, who is one of my favorite companies out there, has great data that shows that at least at Cloudinary, if we don't have 4 people in our deals that we are regularly engaging with, we are likely not going to win that deal. Jordan Schultz, who worked on my team at Dynamic Signal, he had 500 people that he interacted with regularly at IBM. Like, just think about like the work that goes into managing relationships with 500 people. But it got to the point, Max, where people from IBM would call Jordan for advice on how to navigate what's going on at IBM. They would hear a rumor, and rather than asking their boss or asking a peer, they'd pick up the phone and call Jordan.
I think that's crazy. That's crazy. I hope he had some tools like the ones we have at our PDO to manage your stakeholders.
I think this was probably 4 or 5 years ago, so he probably was doing it all in Excel, but like
That's
he
crazy.
he
That's
managed
insane.
it that way.
Yeah.
But the
Mm,
result was that IBM, probably was spending, they were spending just under $2 million a year with Dynamic Signal because of those relationships that Jordan built. And like, if you're a SaaS sales guy on a, Jordan was a good salesperson. So I would recommend that people become, now I'm not saying like everybody's going to go get 500 contacts, but like the best salespeople I've seen at SaaS companies will have 10, 15, 20, maybe 30 people that are involved in a deal, and that they build relationships with those people. They don't get stuck with a single person because they know that that person could get hit by the proverbial bus. The fourth one on my list, Max, is people prepare, like good sellers prepare like crazy. And to me, this is one of the most important, or this is the single most important one. If you want to look great in front of a prospect, if you want to look great in front of a customer, I mean, hell, like if I want to look great in front of, in front of your audience, like you and I did a lot of preparation to show that, to make this look like it's look good. Right? Like, could you imagine going to see your favorite band in concert and they haven't practiced or prepared anything? Like, it would probably be okay, but it wouldn't be amazing. You mentioned, Max, I live in California. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. The Warriors in the NBA Finals. Could you imagine if Steve Kerr got on like the press conference and he's like, "Hey, you know what? We played basketball before. We don't need to go do any prep for this game. We're good." Like, people here would lose their minds. I heard Jerry's. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I love that you bring up this point, because also I'm German, right? So I love to be structured.
Yeah.
I love to be prepared, and I hope my SDRs are listening to this, because I know I can drive them crazy with meeting protocols, with call protocols, with preps, with agendas, but I think it's so crucial. Also, it's really something we owe the buyers, and the clients, to
Absolutely.
go into these meetings and are prepared. So I'm very happy you mentioned this one. Thank you.
Well, yeah, of course. Like I heard Jerry Seinfeld once say, he practices at least 1 hour for every minute that he's on stage, right? And that's how he makes it look so easy. Like, people see him on like the Netflix special, and he does like a 75-minute set, and they're like, "Oh, you know what? I could go do stand up," but like, they don't understand like the amount of work that goes in to making that look so easy. And I think that salespeople that aren't spending at least 1 minute of prep for every minute that they're going to be in a meeting, they are, to your point, Max, they're doing a disservice to themselves and to their customers. Alex Kramer, who is one of the best salespeople that I ever worked with, he would choreograph all of his big meetings down to the minute, and he would leave nothing to chance. He would have a question and answer chart, and we would prepare on this. Is one of the things that we would do to prepare for these meetings is we would ask, I'm going to ask this question. Okay, well, what are the top 3 answers that they're going to give us? And what are our responses for those 3 answers? So we would have everything really, really dialed in down to the minute, so that, we would go in and it's, it looks like we do this all the time. And it just gives the client or the buyer like just a high level of confidence that we're going to make them successful. The next one on my list is, the seller is not afraid to ask the difficult questions that move a deal forward. And I think that this is a tough one, because it isn't actually asking the hard questions. I think anybody can ask a question. It's doing it with tact, right? Anybody can ask a question, but if they're like a bull in a china shop, it's going to come off as arrogant or rude or just kind of offensive. Where, I think about people like Sean Chua, and Sean is one of the top sellers at Cloudinary. And he asks really hard questions, but his superpower is he does it in a way where, people just give him the information. And, he asks questions like, who else needs to be involved in this? What's the process to get this signed off on? Tell me about the last time you bought software. What was that like? What's your legal team like? And those are just some examples, but you really have to dig in and ask the tough questions here. And then kind of the last one, Max, and this is the bonus that you and your team gave me, but I've been thinking about it a lot for the last week or so, is that the person has to use their resources well. I think that if you have a seller on your team and they're trying to lone wolf that deal, you probably have a person that doesn't use their resources particularly well. As we all know, I hope that everybody in the audience here knows, like, sales is a team sport. We are going to win as a team and we lose as a team. And every sales organization that I've ever been in, it literally has an entire company that will bend over backwards to help them win a deal.
Yeah.
Josh Schultz, who's on my team today, a couple of weeks ago, he convinced a couple of people in Israel to wake up at 3:00 in the morning to help him on a deal. And they were happy to do that. They want to see him succeed. Now, I'm not here, Max, advocating that you go wake people up at 3:00 every morning to help you get your deal done. Like that's not scalable. But I suspect that if the people on this call take a look at their pipeline and they take a true inventory of their deals and think about like where their deals are stuck, I bet that there are people in their company that they have never talked with that can help them get that deal done. And maybe some advice for the audience today is like, do that deep dive on your pipeline. Take a look at it and think about like who else in the company could help you move that deal forward a little bit and add some value to that client.
No, and I
So
think
there's my top 6.
And just back to number 6, I think one of the points that also came up, and I think you mentioned it, that you also saw in the past that if people from your team brought you in as an executive, that these guys actually sell more and sign more deals when you have been involved. So I think with the resources also a really, really good point, Scott. But now to maybe
that strokes my ego, man. I love that. Thanks. I'll take it.
Nice. But now, Scott, a more difficult question, a harder question here. Which of these traits can be trained and developed? And maybe you can also touch upon how to develop these traits if that's possible. And I think, I'm sorry for asking the tough questions.
No, I mean that's what we're here for, right? I think that preparation can be trained. Like if you have a meeting coming up, like you should just say like, look, I'm going to have. I mentioned Josh Schultz, but Josh and I were just in a 2-day meeting in visiting a client of ours, and I think that Josh probably spent 2 days. Kind of coaching all of the people. There was 6 of us in the room, 6 of us from Cloudinary in the room, and Josh probably spent 2 days like helping coach and guide the team on what he wanted them to do to make sure that it was a really successful meeting. And the accolades that we got from the client after we left that meeting were really impressive. I'm really proud of the work that the team has done there. So I think that's one that you can train. The uses resources well is one that I think is trainable. But you have to get people out of their comfort zone, right? If you have a lone wolf seller, that person's probably always going to be a lone wolf seller. So you have to push them out of their comfort zone to say like, why don't you go get Bob and Mary, and Bob and Mary can help you get your deal done. The hard questions, Max, like you either have the ability to ask those hard questions or you don't. And I think I have tried to coach sellers to ask hard questions, and I've given them scripts and I've had them write them down. And just in the heat of the moment, they just get paralyzed and they don't know how to ask that question, or they don't want to be perceived as being rude or being a bully or being somebody that is not their friend. And therefore it kind of falls flat. Again, I think comparably to that, Max, like the navigating of an organization and not getting single threaded, like it's a scary question to ask. Like, hey, who else in your organization should I talk to in order to make this, kind of move this project along? And I think if you don't ask that question and you don't ask it in a tactful way, you're always going to be stuck with that one person. And that one person, maybe they can help make something happen, but the odds of that happening in this day and age when there's such a decision by committee that happens, at least with software, like you're going to get stuck with that one person and they're just going to let you down time and time again.
Yeah, definitely. And I've also experienced this for other companies I've been working for. If there were not certain processes in place or also tools that helped to make sure we're not just talking to one person, but talking to the big buying group and all the involved stakeholders, the deals fell through, and at the end you were standing there and you didn't even know what happened. But
I remember Betty said that she was going to make it happen, and Betty kind of let me down, and there's nothing I can do. I don't know what happened there. I think that's a real challenge.
In this context, What about the sales methodologies? There's so many strong opinions out there. There's so many sales methodologies also out there. What is your take on that? Do you have a preference?
Um, I do have a preference,
Yeah.
and I think that this is a good, it's a good follow up to your follow up. I think like if you're talking about Sandler versus solution selling versus Veto versus Medic versus closed loop versus winning by design, like they're all basically saying the same thing, and that is like, identify a pain, see if that pain is big enough to where it's worth fixing, and then figure out what the process is to structure a partnership in order to fix that pain. Um, I prefer Medic. I think that's like the easiest way to see the blind spots in your deal. So if I'm looking at something and I'm like, okay, like do we know who the executive buyer is, and do we know who what the decision process is? If we don't know those, like what's the process to go figure those out? But they're all kind of doing the same thing. Now, what I will say is that a lot of people think about Challenger as a methodology, and I'm not sure if I buy into Challenger as a methodology versus just a way that salespeople need to behave in this new era in order to get deals done. I actually believe that Challenger talks about the challenger, the relationship, the lone wolf, and then the other ones that don't do that well, whose names I can never remember. I actually believe that COVID killed the relationship selling. I don't think that buyers want a friend anymore. I don't think that they care about your dog. I don't think that they want to hear about your vacation. They have a problem. They want it fixed in the fastest, best, least expensive way. And if you're trying to build a relationship before you've shown that you can fix that problem in the fastest, best, least expensive way, like they don't want to hear about anything else. Like, when you've convinced them that you can fix the problem, then maybe you can start talking about your dog and your vacation and your fishing experience and all of that stuff. But man, you have got to convince them, and you only have a short amount of time to do that because they've got a million other projects that they're working on, and hearing about your dog is not something that anybody wants to hear about.
Yeah. True. Yeah. We're coming a bit to an end. I would like to ask two more questions. One
All right, I will
question.
answer quickly. Sorry, I've been kind of ranting on here.
One question. You spend a lot of time in Europe, and you're now in the US, and you really experienced sales on both sides. What are some differences, and what can we learn from each other?
Yeah, I think that Americans are way more aggressive than Europeans. I was told several times that I need to kind of chill out, but we
Yeah.
just push a lot harder, and maybe to a fault, and maybe we should chill out a little bit, but that isn't the culture. Like Americans, they are just like, let's go, 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 go. Europeans are way better at using partners to help get deals closed. I think that this is partially due to language and cultural issues. But it seems like European companies also prefer to buy through partners versus buying direct. When I lived there, 70-ish% of my business was through a partner, whereas here in the US, it's less than 10%. Now, we still work with partners a ton here in the US, and we rely on them for a big part of our business. But when it comes to actually handling the paper and doing the deals for us, I would get calls when I lived in London from partners who were like, hey, we just closed a deal with XYZ company. Here's some money. That never happens, at least it doesn't happen for me here in the US. So I think that, if we could figure out how to work with partners better, it just is, kind of going back to not getting single threaded. Like, how can we leverage some of these other resources more effectively in order to help us to win more business?
Yeah. Interesting. Super interesting. One last question,
Fire away.
Scott. One last question. To wrap it up, what is your key takeaway or your big learning, your recommendation for sales leaders that are watching us right now?
Max, I've been lucky enough that I've worked with hundreds of salespeople throughout my career. At the end of the day, we're all human beings, and we want to be treated as such. One thing that I'm really proud of is that my voluntary attrition rate for employees is really, really low, like less than 2% low. And I think that I've achieved that by focusing on the numbers and setting clear expectations. but also recognizing that working for a spreadsheet manager is a really terrible employee experience. I don't want to be that guy who is like coming to you and saying, "Hey, Max, like you made 96 phone calls today versus the 100. Like, what's going on?" Like, it's just grueling. It's not a great experience. So I've really been able to find that balance between managing to metrics, but also managing to the person. And I think that my advice to any aspiring sales leader would be, not only think about like what are the metrics that you want to manage to, but think about the person as well.
Nice. Yes. Thank you so much for
Max,
these last final words, Scott. What if
great experience. Thank you.
Yeah, what if people have follow-up questions or want to reach out to you? Is there a best way to get a hold of you?
LinkedIn is Scott Schnars. Twitter is Schnars. Pretty much every social network is Schnars.
Nice.
I'm
Nice.
lucky enough that I get the early one. So,
Nice.
but that's the best way to get LinkedIn or Twitter are probably the two best ways to get a hold of me.
Perfect. Okay, but I think there's not much left to say. Thank you so much for joining us, Scott. Everybody watching, thank you for joining in. And we have another LinkedIn Live coming up in June, and then we go into our summer break. So make sure you catch us in June, in the end of June. Have a good one. Bye-bye,
Max,
everyone.
great
Thank you,
experience.
Scott.
Thank you. Thank you.